Hello and welcome to this week's episode of A Mic on the Podium with me, Michael Seal. Before we start, I'd like to thank my latest subscriber on Patreon, Suzanne, thank you, for your support and all my other Patreon supporters. If you would like to support the podcast, go to patreon.com/A Mic on the Podium, and there you'll find many ways to subscribe, plus extra bonus material and episodes to enjoy. That's patreon.com. You can also support the show by leaving a review or rating on Apple Podcasts, which is greatly appreciated and will help the podcast reach a much bigger audience. Today, I conduct a conversation with an English conductor who is also a broadcaster and author. He has been principal conductor with the BBC National Orchestra of Wales and music director of English National Opera, as well as guest conducting all over the world. It's a great pleasure to welcome Mark Wigglesworth. Mark, real pleasure to speak to you today. I hope you're well.
Very well, yes, good afternoon.
And how are you coping at the moment? Are you learning scores? Because I know I'm not. I mean, I've been busy doing podcasts, but I know a lot of conductors are not learning scores. They're spending the time doing other things. What have you been doing?
Well, I think those of us who are parents are certainly very engaged in that responsibility. And it's tempting to think, I've got this time for scores, but as you say, it's quite hard to focus and concentrate, and there's so many bigger issues going around that it's easier said than done, I would say.
I wonder if we could go right back to the very beginning. When did music first touch your life and enter into your consciousness?
I was quite a conventional child learning the music, I think, played the piano, then the violin. The musical household, my parents were both very musical, neither were musicians, but it was very much in the family. I think I started too late, though, to be able to feel truly comfortable on the instrument. I think as hard as it is to start a child young, I do think that is what has to happen, certainly with violin and piano. And the technique was always a struggle. And conducting was a nice way out of that, to be honest. I just felt with the piano particularly, I played all these sort of difficult pieces, but it was always a stress and a strain. And it didn't feel like it was me. I loved it. And I would say it defined my childhood and school years, was practicing the piano, but I never really felt like I could express myself through it.
And with the violin, did you play in ensembles and orchestras?
I played in school orchestras. Yes.
Was that a place where you enjoyed music making?
I did enjoy it. I mean, at the school I went to, the emphasis really was on playing. And at home, the emphasis was on playing as opposed to listening. And in the 70s, frankly, there wasn't much available. I mean, nowadays, there's so much that you can listen to, and it's very easy just to be a passive music lover. In the school very much believed that music was something you did. And I think that's a fantastic experience. So, all sort of quartets and string orchestras and orchestras. I mean, I was never good on the violin at all, but I think learning it was probably more useful to me now than learning the piano.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a subject that came up in a previous podcast with Karina Kanalakis, about the fact that,
of course, yes,
as violinists, we were both professional violinists, but do we consider ourselves lucky in the fact that we learned a stringed instrument? When you later on you come to work with orchestras, and I think we both agreed that we did.
I think there's a sense of bow speed and bow pressure influences your own speed and pressure of beat, and that's valid for sort of 2/3 of the orchestra. It feels a very comfortable connection.
So, at what point of school or Manchester Uni did conducting first enter into your life?
Definitely at school. I did it as part of my A-level, actually. A quarter of my A-level was conducting a concert. And some guy came down from London to adjudicate it, and the school, admirable really, with hindsight, to give me the choir and give me the orchestra and allow me to put on a concert, public concert, or probably not many public there, but a concert, and they trusted me to do it. And so from a very early age, it felt kind of okay and sort of psychologically okay and natural. And then at university, I spent most of my time fixing orchestras and putting on concerts, like most of us, I suspect.
Purely out of interest, was that A-level, because we're not too dissimilar in age, the old A-level practical, because you could do an A-level theoretical and A-level practical in music, and it was an easy way of getting 2 A-levels.
Interesting. It was just a 1 A-level,
right?
But half of it, a quarter of it was conducting, and a quarter of it was piano, I think, which is quite far-sighted of whichever board it was.
Yeah.
At the time.
When you were at Manchester University, did you have any conducting lessons, or was it when you left and went to the Royal Academy that you got lessons?
I didn't have any lessons specifically at university, but I'd already started going to George Hurst at Canford in the summers, which was life-changing, to be honest. And it was quite hard to get anybody at Manchester University to take any interest in what I was doing from that point of view. I learnt an enormous amount by doing it, but I didn't have any lessons from... I was at the university, not the Royal Northern, and so obviously it was a slightly more academic approach, and they tolerated my conducting experiences. But no, nobody taught me anything until I properly started at the Royal Academy of Music with George, of course, and Colin Metters and John Carew.
What did George teach you specifically? Did he have an all-round approach, or was he very hot on one particular thing?
Well, he was a very domineering personality.
Right.
And I completely fell under his spell. And I would say that he taught me everything I like about my conducting and everything I hate about my conducting. And it took me a very long time, and I'm probably still engaging in this, to sort of find my own way. When you have such a powerful teacher on a psychological level who you come across very young, it's very hard to realize there are other ways of doing things. And of course, what's right for one conductor is not right for another. So finding your own voice was difficult with him, to be honest. But his care for the music and his understanding of logic, by which I mean he always wanted you to be traveling from A to B and knowing the flexibility of tempo. I remember doing sort of the variations with him, Eroica or Enigma, and he would, the sort of subtlety of which he would adjust things was very thought-provoking, and I think something that I spend a lot of time now thinking about.
And then when you went to the academy, you said Colin Metters and John Carew were also teaching.
They were wonderfully different. I mean,
yes.
and I think at the time I found it confusing to have such different approaches, but with hindsight, again, it forced you to find your own way. And that is a really good thing, because I think the danger of conducting courses and institutions is that you come out a reflection of that course or that institution. What was good about the academy was George came in occasionally, Colin sort of held the reins for most of the time, and we had weekly visits, I think, to John Carew, who was very provocative musically, in a good way, and really made you think that ultimately it's the music that matters. And of course, technique is significant skill to have, but if you don't know what you're wanting to express, then there's no point having a technique.
Yeah, well, I mean, what a great basis those three different, as you say, you look back on it now, those three different teachers and teaching approaches, and I think that's almost the art of a great teacher. Is it's sometimes 20 years later you're still thinking, hang on a minute, what they said then means this now. And they weren't just producing clones of themselves, which is very admirable.
I think what I really remember from that, when you're at an institution for 3 years, as the academy course was in those days, there's a lot that you don't remember, to be honest. But I remember half a dozen, and frankly, half a dozen is plenty, of moments that changed my outlook on conducting for the better. And, half a dozen moments might not sound a lot in 3 years, but they were so fundamental to trying to get better that just being pushed, having certain buttons pressed at the right time, is something I'm very grateful for.
So how long after you left the academy did you enter the conducting competition?
3 weeks.
Wow.
So that was, I'm convinced I did well in that competition because I had no expectation of doing so. And I had nothing else to do leaving the academy. I had no idea what I was going to do. And so why not go to Amsterdam? One-way ticket, didn't take my concert gear because that was only going to be in the final where I had to get there. So I didn't have that with me. And the whole thing, I think my naivety is a very good quality to have, and experience can force you to ask too many questions. And I was very relaxed and thought the whole thing was rather thrilling.
It sounds very similar to the experience of Andrew Litton and Martin Brabbins, both of which who won competitions and both of which who entered thinking, well, this will be a bit of fun. Andrew Litton in particular, he said, I probably won't get past the first round. I'll have a week sightseeing in London and go home. And yeah, I think they both went into it very relaxed and sort of, with no expectations of getting to the final even.
One of my memories of that was one of the other contestants coming out and showing me the baton he used for Mozart and the baton he used for Tchaikovsky. And me feeling, I had no idea one needed a different baton for every composer. Being sort of completely freaked out by this, which was presumably this person's intention. But anyway. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, I don't think I could. How many batons would we have to own if that was the case?
Well, quite.
Unbelievable. And so winning a competition like that, part of the prize is always a list of guest engagements. And in previous episodes, I called it the hamster wheel of guest conducting. And so how was that for you? Literally thrown into a career or the startings of a career?
Well, I said no to the prize, actually. The prize was, as you say, sort of between 10 and 15 orchestras had promised the winner a concert. And we're talking serious orchestras, Montreal Symphony, Berlin Radio Symphony, I can't remember some of them, but A-level orchestras. And I just felt that having won didn't make me ready. Just because I'd won, I didn't feel ready. So I didn't take up any of those offers. But what I did get, and so that it was an agent as a result of this. And I say that because it sounds very impressive to be able to turn down these orchestras. And I don't know if I'd have had the confidence to do that if I hadn't had management to sort of, find me more suitable orchestras to work with initially. So it was, I was able to be that suspicious of myself, that precious, if you like, because there was a sort of safety net had been created. And so the thing that really came from the competition was management.
Well, that's a subject I've not touched on at all in the previous 20 or so episodes, is management. Agents and managers are very, very important in our lives as conductors. What would you say would be the most important characteristic of the agents and managers that you've had? You've had 2 managers, I think.
2 main managers, and I think it is a fascinating and I think very complicated relationship, to be honest. Who's working for who's is always an intriguing one. At its best, though, the manager is telling you you shouldn't do that, or you should do this. And that kind of advice from a trusted source is invaluable, because it's very hard to be truly objective in your own work. You shouldn't be, frankly. So to know how something's working is always challenging. And ideally you have somebody who you trust, who is in a position to say, do you know what, I don't think you should work with that orchestra, or I don't think that is the right piece for you to do with that orchestra. And it's quite hard to persuade them that you want them to be that honest. Because part of their job is also to keep you confident. And they want you to feel good about yourself. So, too much, it's all very well saying, tell me what the orchestra thought, tell me what the orchestra thought. Well, up to a point. do you want to know that? Yeah. And, on any given day, how much criticism you want to hear is going to vary. So I think the manager has a very difficult job of knowing when to encourage and when to put a sort of realistic glasses on you.
Especially at the age you're talking of, coming out of the contracting competition and having just finished your studies, that your first agent is a very important relationship.
I think, on looking back, and I don't criticize my management for this, I think we all have to take responsibility for our choices, and it's wrong to blame others for the choices that you were adamant you wanted to make. But on reflection, I made some bad choices, I think, early on, or certainly choices that I regret. I don't know, it's easy for me to say I wish a manager had told me not to do something, because I don't know how I would have reacted at the time. So it's not necessarily, it's easy to look back, isn't it? But yeah. I think basically I was overexposed too early. And now there are far more young conductors than there were 30 years ago. There were very few conductors in their 20s then. Whether that is now easier or harder, I wouldn't know. But because the pressure to be a success in your 20s now is quite strong. 30 years ago, I didn't sense any pressure from the profession, if you like, but certainly there was a pressure from the orchestras, who felt, understandably, what is this 26-year-old doing conducting a Mahler symphony with us?
No, you're right, it has changed. I remember 30 years ago distinctly, because it was around the time I was leaving, or in the middle of music college and leaving. And, a young conductor such as yourself, 26, 25, 24, like Simon or whatever, those names sort of leapt at you because, there's a new young conductor. Nowadays, they're appearing every 5 minutes. And as you say, maybe it's easier for them to sort of slip under the radar a bit and make more mistakes, because we all have to make mistakes to get better in some degree when you're young.
I think the problem I had was that my mistakes were were pretty public. I conducting in the proms in 91, I think, Barbican and Festival Hall all around that time, and I was thrilled to be doing it and incredibly grateful for the opportunities. But looking back, you just feel, you wonder if a little slower would have been a more enjoyable learning experience, because it is hard to learn when you're under that much pressure.
Under the spotlight, exactly.
Yeah.
Looking at those times, you were associate conductor with the BBC Symphony Orchestra for 2 years. Was that really the first appointment that you had after winning the contraction competition?
Absolutely. And John Drummond, who was sort of running the world at the time, was wonderfly supportive. But again, you wonder whether he was perhaps too supportive. But as I say, I certainly was grateful at the time.
And whilst we're in BBC World, your first job as music director, it wasn't, it was principal conductor, but it was with BBC National Orchestra of Wales. how was that? Did you enjoy working in with the BBC? With the amount of repertoire that you have to get through, often some of it rather obscure, and then mixed in with standard stuff. What were those years like in Cardiff?
I enjoyed it a lot. The BBC National Orchestra of Wales has the huge advantage that it's the National Orchestra of Wales, as well as the BBC Orchestra. So it had a remit to perform the widest range of repertoire without anybody saying, "You're a BBC Orchestra, surely you should be doing the minority composers." So we were able to do a fantastic blend of repertoire, and I didn't feel overly stretched in that respect at all. I think looking back on it, I enjoyed it musically a lot. I think I probably got too involved in the organization of everything for anybody's good, including my own. But I felt at the time that was part of the job of being a music director, to sort of get your hands dirty with all the aspects of the organization. I'm not sure if that's true anymore, or I'm not sure anymore if that's true, that your job probably is to stick to music as much as possible. But I enjoyed the musical relationship with them hugely.
I think with the BBC, maybe that's the case, is that you are less required to know about the players' contracts, about funding, about all of the minutiae that you would need to know if you were running an opera house or a symphony orchestra that wasn't affiliated to the BBC. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that seems to be the case.
Well, yes, it certainly was the case then, and I think my feeling that I did think it mattered that how people's lives were affected by the BBC affected the music making. But you have to draw a line as to what your responsibility is. And looking back, I think to have stuck to the music would have been probably a smoother ride.
Looking at another area of music making that you're particularly fond of, well, I'm assuming you are, because I'm going to list a whole stream of opera houses that you've worked at. Bavarian State Opera, Semper Oper Dresden, Yesteryear, Netherlands Opera, Welsh National Opera Glyndebourne, also English National Opera as music director. What is it about opera that you love and love conducting?
Well, I love the words and the drama, and I love the theatre in the most sort of obvious sense. I love being in the pit in a darkened auditorium with the lights. I love the smell of makeup and that whole kind of sense of occasion that an opera is thrilling. And I love the fact that you're working on the same piece with the same people for how many weeks it is. There is something very on a human level, there's something very stimulating about that. More challenging, of course, for obvious reasons, but when the human dynamic is right between you and the director and the singers and the stage management and the orchestra and the chorus, there's nothing better than that.
And do you try and actively get a really good mix of, because as you said, opera takes 6, 7, 8 weeks to put together, and then the run of performances. Whereas, if you go and do some of your work as principal guest at Adelaide in Australia, for instance, you might only be there for a week or 2 weeks. Do you try and mix that well during the year with you and your agent, or would you be happier doing more opera and less symphonic, or the other way around?
I'm very happy doing a balance, which is sort of 50-50 in an ideal world. Opera is planned further in advance, as you know, so you kind of are able to put the operas in first. Interestingly, in the situation we're in now, opera's got, I think, far more complicated way through this than the symphony orchestra. Symphony orchestra can, get back up and running as soon as it's safe and everybody wants it to. The nightmares that opera organizations must be going through in terms of the knock-on effects of things being postponed or cancelled is heaven knows what they're having to do. But under normal circumstances, putting the operas in first is just a practical response to the timing of the profession. But I would be disappointed not to do any opera in any given year.
How many operas would you manage to fit in a year?
I think proper operas, by which I mean proper engagements of 6 or 8 weeks, as you say,
Yes.
including ideally you're looking at just 2.
Right.
And once you start to do more of that, then your preparation time is going to be slightly compromised and your symphonic time is going to be reduced. So 2 is, I mean, they're big things, operas, that, you know, they need a lot of time to prepare them and then to rehearse them and then to perform them. And I love that, but 2 is probably an ideal, yeah.
When you say proper operas, are you alluding to the sort of going in for one night and doing a La Bohème because everybody knows that you can conduct La Bohème or Carmen, or
yes, that's exactly what I mean.
Yeah, that's an improper opera.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I've done a couple of things like that in Germany, and it's actually far more positive than I thought it would be, and far more creative than it might sound, because there is a problem with too much rehearsal, in that your performances become a recreation of what you've all agreed is going to happen. And the danger of that is obvious. When you don't have any rehearsal, then the performances are going to be very creative. And if you take an opera that people do know, I've done Mozart's in this in the situations you're talking about, then the orchestra knows it and the singers know it, and then, of course, nobody knows how it's going to be that night. And if things go well, that can be incredibly exciting.
Yeah,
it's a bit. I remember once in Munich, the concertmaster during one of the recitatives asking me whether the next aria was going to be in 2 or 4, and that is slightly unnerving to realize the level of that one's engaging in, but it forces you to be very clear, and it enables you to be actually quite free at the same time.
Yeah, I suppose well, also you have to resort to being clear with your hands and arms and facial gestures that after a lot of rehearsal maybe you don't need to, as you said, because it's already been arranged, prescribed, described, whereas
Absolutely.
you just go in on the seat of your pants.
The first time I did one of these things, I really realized how much expectation I was used to having been created by the rehearsal, and the responsibility to just give an upbeat is a healthy one to engage in.
Teaching. Do you teach in any form at all? I mean, even if it's just masterclasses, but do you teach, and do you enjoy teaching?
Well, I've never taught, but I've given a lot of masterclasses. And the distinction, I think, is that I have huge respect and admiration for the responsibility that teachers take on. In other words, I can go into some institution and give a masterclass. I see some conductors, and it's very easy to immediately say what you think about what they're doing. And to a certain extent, it's very easy for them to respond to that. And everybody has a good time, and it's very rewarding. I love being reminded of the things I care about when I'm in a situation where I don't have to impose them on myself. I can be objective about the whole craft, and that is fantastically educational for me as well, hopefully, as for the students. But I think to take responsibility, which a teacher needs to do, for somebody's long-term growth, if you like, is something that, first of all, I wouldn't have the time for, but secondly, I don't know if I've got the experience or knowledge of what that really means.
Mm.
Because if you're teaching somebody and that person doesn't respond to what you're doing, you've got to find a way through that. In a masterclass scenario, you're moving on to the next person, frankly. So I love it, and I love I love the opportunity that it brings to talk to the orchestra about what we're doing, because I think a lot of orchestras, obviously there's so much ignorance on both sides, frankly, conductors and orchestras, about what our pressures and needs are. And so to have the opportunity with a student orchestra to, I've done it with some professional orchestras, but on the whole it's with student orchestras, but to discuss in a slightly more collaborative way what is working here and what is not working here and why that might be. I enjoy allowing the orchestra to understand a little bit about what we're all going through.
I couldn't agree more. I think whenever I've done something like this, and I've either been with youth orchestras or at the Conservatoire in Birmingham, that both, obviously the student gets something out of the masterclass, but the orchestra, especially if you can now and again just pitch something at them and point out how we think, it gets them thinking. Then about the whole conductor-orchestra relationship. It's a two-way street, and it really does get them thinking, even down to the point I have at some point asked the conductor, whispered in their ear and asked them to do a specific thing, and then told the orchestra afterwards, did you notice that they did this? And the amount of people who don't notice, and then they're engaged, they're watching your every move. I think more orchestras should do it.
Absolutely, and I think, frankly, every music college, if you want to play in an orchestra, you should have to have some conducting lessons or exposure to it, because so much of the orchestral player's life is affected by their view of the conductor.
Yes.
In that they don't have to want to do it or be good at it, but just to realize, as you say, to create more of a two-way understanding. Similarly, a conductor should sit in orchestra rehearsals.
Yes.
And I think music colleges are not engaging enough in helping a relationship between conductor and orchestra, and because it's not just for the conductor's benefit that relationship needs to be improved. It's arguably more so for the players whose day-to-day life can so easily be affected by the conductor, and their knowledge of what conducting is not going to improve the conductor that's standing in front of them, but it's going to enable them to articulate their frustrations or their thrills about the day's work, and that has to be a good thing.
When you come to learn a new score, do you have a set system for learning it? For instance, do you sit at the piano, or do you sit in a quiet room at your desk? Do you start at the beginning and work your way through? Do you flick through it? Do you use pencils of different colours? What is your system?
I can tell you what I don't do first, because that's easier. I don't sit at the piano, partly because I'm not a good enough pianist, but secondly because I think our job is to engage in colour and sonority, and a piano doesn't, if you're amazing at the piano, of course you can do that, but you need to be amazing to do it. So the piano doesn't really help me unless it's a very modern score that I can't hear, and obviously then I would sort of go to it. I don't mark much in the scores, certainly not in colour, partly because I don't know what to write in, and secondly I'm worried of coming back to the score, then you are repeating some previous experience of it. So I like to keep my scores quite pure. That's not to say I don't write anything in, and there is something about the action of doing the odd pencil sort of mark that somehow creates a connection between you and the music that is more significant than actually what you've written. So I do understand the reason people do it. I try to I'm quite methodical about how I split a piece up and study it, and I tend to go through the piece initially quite quickly, and then slower, and then slower, and then slower, and then go through it faster, and go through it faster, and go through it faster. So it's like a sort of diamond shape in which the beginning and the end of the process is quite quick to get through the piece. I don't think you can't just start at the beginning and turn each page only when you've learned it, whatever that means. So I have to kind of keep moving, but I do need to, obviously you can never say I know that piece. And I've got better as I've got older at accepting that I'm not going to really know it until I'm working with the musicians.
That's a fair
and
point.
the reason I hesitate to say that, but also hesitated to feel that when I was younger, was I felt surely it's my job to know exactly what I think about the piece, and that's going to come from my preparation. And although that is still true, I think there's a great danger of being, I wouldn't say over-prepared, but prepared in a way that is no longer open to what happens in rehearsal.
And
absolutely. Actually to realize that your decisions ultimately need to be circumstantial. It's not your tempo that matters. It's what does your tempo sound like when played by those musicians? That's what matters. So being more trusting, not of the players, but of yourself, to embrace what you hear and work with that. You still need to be prepared before you arrive, but you do need to be open. And I think having that combination of conviction and courage to release your conviction is an ideal balance.
So away from the podium, you have presented a 6-part TV series on BBC called Everything to Play For, written articles for The Guardian and The Independent, and sitting next to me on my desk is your book, The Silent Musician, Why Conducting Matters, which is a wonderful book, 6 or 7 chapters about all aspects of what conducting is. I think you write at the beginning, it's not a manual for conductors, but it encompasses everything, thought processes, your health, your attitude, learning music. What persuaded you, or who persuaded you to write a book? And did you enjoy the process of doing it?
I wanted to write it for a long time. I'm glad I waited because obviously after 30 years of thinking about it, I felt it's definitely, as you say, it's definitely not a manual for conductors. It's because all of us are different, and we have to be true to ourselves. And it's not necessarily even how I conduct, disappointingly, it's how I'd like to conduct. So it's what I aspire to. I don't put it down as being this is what I do, but it's certainly what I believe in as being some kind of ideal. It's written mainly for an inquisitive audience member who wants to understand the relationship. But I'd like to think that conductors and players recognize some things in it that are interesting and helpful.
At this point, I'm going to read out to the listener, and just so the listener knows, this has been done afterwards and edited in, a list of things that Mark asked some players that they expected conductors to be. So here is the list. Conductors need good baton technique, rehearsal technique, musicianship, knowledge, an interpretive conviction, an ability to communicate, to stretch and challenge people, to make the performance better than the rehearsals, to be inspirational, have a good ear, clear thoughts, reliability, competence, rhythm, an expressive face, sense of structure, ability to accompany, style, suitability for the repertoire, originality, knowledge of string bowing, an ability to collaborate, analyse and solve difficulties, explain why things need to be repeated, empower people, train people, make people listen. They must not talk, over-rehearse, under-rehearse, or be musically detached. They must have good manners, humour, respect, approachability, enthusiasm, encouragement, humility, positive spirit, patience, leadership, sincerity, audibility, creativity, an awareness of everyone, self-control, and strength of character. They must be relaxed, self-confident, empathetic, punctual, motivating, polite, authoritative, realistic, interesting, charismatic, persevering, committed, well-dressed, and even-tempered. They must be popular with audiences and show chastity, poverty, and obedience to the score. They must not be egocentric, intimidating, sarcastic, rude, boring, nervous, bullying, ugly, smelly, overfamiliar, detached, pedantic, cynical, insecure, or blinkered. They must not change things for the sake of it, glare at mistakes, or hit the music stand. So, Mark, tell us about that list.
Well, every word of that is true. I asked an orchestra for their views, and I didn't make any of those words up. And I think it brings home the impossibility of our certainly the impossibility of our psychological task, as in you can't please everybody any of the time, frankly, let alone all the time. And you have to be, in the end, when you look at that list, you have to think, well, then the only option is to be true to myself. The only option is to do what I believe. I think some of those things are instructive for us to think about. But what is sort of funny about the list is, of course, the contradictions within it.
Yes, of course.
And if you're too stressed about over rehearsing or under rehearsing, or that's talking, not talking, you can just end up trying to be somebody you're not, and that's what the players don't want that either.
I think that's what also comes out in the book. Reading it is that you don't, as you said, it's not a manual. What it does is it gives you options. You often will say, I think that this is potentially the way that you should behave or conduct or be, but then this is also plan B is also acceptable. Plan X, Y, and Z are not acceptable, but then C and D are also acceptable. You often give many different answers to problems, and I think that's why it was an interesting read.
Well, I struggled quite a lot with the fact that I was always contradicting myself, or at least putting the other point of view. And when I was thinking of a title for the book, balance was something that kept coming up. Couldn't fit that into the title. We are dealing with not one way. We are dealing with a variety of approaches to a situation, because situations, whether musically or because of the people in front of you, changing all the time, you can't approach it with one way. You have to have options, and there is no one way. There's no one way for an orchestra. There's no one way for a composer.
Yeah, it's a marvelous book. I recommend anybody who's interested in classical music, orchestras, and conducting to buy it and read it. And yeah, wonderful book. And thank you for writing it.
Thank you. I loved writing it. I was conducting at the same time as writing, which I was glad about, because I think if I'd shut myself away for 6 months, I would have forgotten things. And there were quite a few things that I sort of thought about as I was conducting that I must get into the book. But what I actually being forced to really think about what you feel, which is what writing does, was provoked me into some thoughts I hadn't had before. And I think the best bits of the book, or at least the parts of the book that I like best, are the ones, new thoughts that came to me as a result of the need to write them down.
So, Mark, it's 10 questions time. And as ever, I start with, what sound or noise do you love, and what sound or noise do you hate?
Well, they're connected, because I think my daughter's laughter is the best noise I ever hear, and her tears are the worst. So that's the two sides of one coin.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've got two daughters, and yes, to hear them giggling, they're now 17 and 20, but to hear them giggling and laughing is wonderful. If you had 24 hours free, what would you spend it doing?
This was a very interesting question because we're so obsessed, all of us, aren't we? And we sort of think, oh, we should learn more music. But I would have to go for a walk, a long walk, to get out of the house, to get out of the opportunity of being distracted either by real life stuff or work stuff or the phone or the computer. But to go on a 10-hour walk would be my day of choice.
And where would it be? Do you have a specific place you'd like to go walking?
I don't think it matters where you walk, although I'd want to not see anybody. That would be quite an important thing. I live pretty isolated part of the country, so walking around here is healthy from that point of view.
Right.
But it would definitely be countryside, and as I say, ideally nobody else.
Yeah, my favourite days on tour were with one or two mates on a free day. I'm talking about when I was in the orchestra, one or two mates, and we never saw anybody else in the orchestra for the whole day.
Yes.
That was always a wonderful free day. Who would be a favourite conductor of yesteryear?
Well, I'm sure a lot of people have answered this similarly. It so depends on the repertoire, doesn't it? And all of us have music that speaks to us more powerfully than others, and I would go to certain conductors for certain pieces of music. But I think in terms of sort of more recent times, Bardo and Haitink, I mean, Haitink is still alive, but in terms of, he feels like a yesteryear conductor because he's been around so long. I think what I admire so much about them is their ability to be at the center of it all, and yet actually it's not about them. Even though they've got completely different temperaments, and even Bardo, you think of him as a very glamorous figure, but still watching him conduct, so emotional, but it's not his emotion. And that's, I really aspire to that ability to be creating without overly involving yourself.
And who would be a favourite current conductor?
Well, it's the same question in terms of repertoire, because
yes,
certainly, what I think we are expected to be all-round musicians, but there's something healthy about being so. But in reality, we have affinities and empathies that are strong. But I think taking aside sort of musical sensitivities that I might respond to, I think Ivan Fischer's approach to the relationship with the orchestra is one I admire hugely. I love how iconoclastic he is. I love how sort of radical he is, and just he endlessly curious about what might be possible. And I think we need that lack of predictability, not in music, but in terms of the process of a concert and what that might mean for the public. I think his relationship to an orchestra feels to me very healthy.
What is the hardest work you have ever conducted?
Well, I think it is circumstantial. That it depends on the orchestra. You can have certain pieces that you thought were going to be easy, and then for various reasons the chemistry isn't right, and doing it is unbelievably difficult, and vice versa.
Yes.
But I think the piece that I will always remember as being unbelievably difficult, and that was with an orchestra that was fantastic, a relationship that was very positive, and everything going for it, and I still found it unbelievably difficult, was Berg's Lulu. That was a very stressful experience to give the control that it needs with the Viennese lightness. Balancing that was unbelievably hard. Yeah, I would love to do it again to see if I could have a go at making it less difficult.
I've only ever played in the suite, and that was hard enough. Yeah, tough piece. That's the palindromic one, isn't it, Lulu?
All of that, and
Yeah.
one can go down all sorts of rabbit holes trying to work out, the things behind the music. But in the end, it is just beautiful, lilting, lyrical, in schmaltz, albeit within a highly organized, rigorous system. And you add that into the opera world, where everybody is kind of emotional, and that's a hard set of ingredients to cook.
When travelling abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without?
That was actually quite an easy one for me. Earplugs. I find the noise pollution of our world so exhausting, and the opportunity to get rid of some of it. I mean, obviously, you still hear a little bit, but it keeps you in your own world when you're traveling around. And I get very stressed if I don't have my earplugs with me. I take them out to conduct, I should add.
What is the one thing you would change about being a conductor?
This is really hard because I don't know the answer to that, which I'm not going to cop out, but I think it would be something to do with the relationship you have with the musicians. And I don't blame the musicians for it. Of course I don't. But it's so hard for conductors to know sometimes what an orchestra wants, because there is a barrier there, which is partly practical and partly professional. But when that barrier is too severe, nobody benefits. So that is what I would like to change. But what I really mean by that, I don't know. And certainly how one does it, I don't know. But I do think as we alluded to earlier, at the music college level, there is not enough training given about conducting to players and about players to conducting. And somehow the courses need to be more joined up from a very early age. And I think that would get rid of a lot of frustration that can build up in the rehearsal room.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Well, the fantasy one would be something to do with cricket.
Oh, another cricket fan, wonderful.
But the more real one would be writing, and I do love the precision of words, and I do love the control. I mean, I believe when you conduct, you shouldn't be in control completely. You should work with the players in the music making, obviously, but writing, it really is just up to you, and there's something wonderfully demanding and exacting about that. But also, you can take great pride in what you've written, if you like it.
If the world were to end tonight, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
Well, of course, if it was going to end tonight, you wouldn't have to worry about health, would you?
No, not at all. No, that was
why.
That's why I worded the question like that.
It would certainly be a pudding, for sure. And I don't have I wouldn't say I have extravagant taste. So I'd be very happy with something like a apple crumble and ice cream, and cream. You have to have both cream and ice cream at the same time.
And something to wash it down?
Well, before that, I would love to have had a perfect glass of wine, but I would need somebody to choose that for me.
Mark, real pleasure. I had a lovely time chatting to you, and I hope to see you very soon.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's been a pleasure.
A Mic on the Podium was devised and produced by Michael Seal, with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I chat to a conductor who, until his early 30s, was very happy in his career as a flautist. Since starting conducting at that point, he has definitely made up for lost time by having held positions as chief conductor or music director on 4 continents. Until then, bye-bye.